Come, you masters of war, you that build the big guns, you that build the death planes, you that build all the bombs, you that hide behind walls, you that hide behind desks. Well, I just want you to know I can see through your masks.
Welcome. We're really happy that you've come here for the Stop Banking the Bong teach-in. First order of business, you have an index card, or if you don't, you can get one. This is for if you have any questions during the presentations. We will basically be doing all of the questions and answers at the end of the 4 speakers. But if you have a question for one of the particular speakers and you think it would be appropriate to ask it to get the information during that person speaking, please just write it on the card and then kind of hold it up and we'll come and get it and see. If it's going to get into a long discussion, we probably will still hold it till the end. On the other hand, if it's something that would really augment and is important to the presentation, we'll get it to the speaker to get the question answered right away. So my job today is to welcome you and then also to introduce the speakers. And our first speaker is Zeba Ahmed, who is representing Remembering Hiroshima, Imagining Peace. Sorry, let me say that again. Remembering Hiroshima, Imagining Peace. Since 2013, Zeba has been a member of Remembering Hiroshima, Imagining Peace, an organization which holds events to communicate a message of peace and opposition to nuclear weapons throughout the Pittsburgh community in a way that is both creative and dynamic. She has traveled to Japan multiple times and has visited areas impacted by the 2011 nuclear disaster in Fukushima. So, Zeba.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start off with this picture. I know some people here recognize it, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, does anyone have any guesses about what this picture is of? You can just throw out some ideas.
Looks like a garden.
A garden?
Libro baseball league.
Oh, yes. So this is a spot on the north side. It was a project I did to I started it to clean up a lot that was kind of overgrown and didn't look so nice, but had these artworks on it, and so we restored the artworks and made it look really nice. And if you want to go to the next slide, you can see this is what it used to look like. And so, oh yeah. Do the lights get any dimmer? No? Okay. Sorry, you just have to deal with this quality of picture. If you want to go to the next slide. So the reason I bring this up is because I'm interested in community development, peace, and Japan. And so I work for a community group in the north side, and I also am a member of Remembering Hiroshima, Imagining Peace. And like I said before, I've been to Japan several times. So I studied abroad in Japan 3 times, and the 3rd time I was lucky enough, I had the opportunity to go to Sendai, Japan, which is over here in the northeast part of Japan. And yeah, so when I was there, I knew about the Fukushima disaster, and I was like, this is a really good opportunity to visit the disaster areas and learn as much as I can about what happened there and the current status. So I visited it in 2014 to 2015, and I visited different tsunami-impacted areas as well as Fukushima Prefecture, where the nuclear disaster was. So now I'm going to explain a little bit about the disaster itself for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So this is a map showing the eastern side of Japan. And so near the top, you can see Sendai. That's where I studied abroad. And then below that is Fukushima, which there is a nuclear power plant there. And then below that, near the bottom, is Tokyo, which, is the capital of Japan. So in 2011, there was a really big earthquake, and this caused a really big tsunami that was one of the biggest tsunamis that Japan has experienced in recent history. And the tsunami knocked out the power systems in the Fukushima power plant, and this caused a nuclear meltdown. So that region of Japan experienced an earthquake, which actually didn't cause that much damage because they're used to having earthquakes, but it also caused a tsunami, which caused a lot of damage, and then the nuclear meltdown, which caused a whole different type of damage. So if you want to go to the next slide. So here's a little bit of the timeline of what happened. So the day of the disaster, after the tsunami hit, they lost power, and even their backup systems failed. And so that's what led to the nuclear meltdown. And then the next day, it wasn't until the next day in the morning, really early in the morning, the government announced that they were declaring an evacuation zone. So everyone who had already evacuated because of the tsunami had to evacuate again because of the nuclear evacuation zone. So they had to get clear out of their shelters and find somewhere else to evacuate to. And then as events unfolded and they followed the progression of the disaster and tried to figure out how bad it was, they just kept finding out it was worse and worse than they originally thought. So they found out a few weeks later that the scale was pretty much as bad as Chernobyl, the disaster in Russia in the 1980s. And so then eventually in April, they had to expand the evacuation zone to include places like Iitate. Next slide, please. So then they began to figure out like what kinds of, what other impacts there will be. So one of the things they discovered was that the Fukushima power plant was leaking radioactive water. So groundwater and water from outside the plant would flow into the plant, get contaminated by the fuel, and then flow into the ocean. And so this is a problem that is so big that they still haven't figured out what to do about it, even though it's been seven years. One of the things they tried is building an ice wall, which they completed last year. So basically they froze the soil around the power plant, hoping that groundwater, it would decrease the amount of groundwater flowing into the power plant. Kind of works, maybe doesn't, but they tried, and it's expensive, but they tried. Another thing that happened was right after the disaster, they raised the allowable level of radiation exposure for children. So normally, children should only be exposed to 1 millisievert of radiation or of radiation absorption per year. But they're like, you know what, like this is a really big disaster, it's gonna take a while to fix, so we're gonna make it 20, which if it doesn't sound horrifying, it should sound horrifying. And if you can go to the next slide. To help you understand how to comprehend radiation terms, so there's 2 ways to measure radiation. One is becquerels, which is the amount of radiation being released by the particles. And the other one is sieverts, which is the amount of radiation your body is being impacted by, like the absorption of it. So we're going to focus on sieverts because we're worried about how people are being impacted. So if you can go to the next slide. This is a map that I pulled up this morning, and it shows, it's a little bit hard to see the colors here, but it shows the amount, by showing the different colors, it shows the amount of sieverts being emitted in different areas around the Fukushima power plant. So I clicked on the Fukushima power plant, and so that is emitting 14,000 nanosieverts per hour. So we were talking about millisieverts before, right? So 1 millisievert per year was the original limit for children. 20 millisieverts per year is the current limit. And so if you do some math and figure out, based on the amount of radiation the power plant is currently emitting per hour, you can figure out that if you were just to like live there in the area around the power plant, you would get exposed to 122 millisieverts per year. So it's 122 times the allowable limit, original allowable limit for children. And it's even worse inside the power plant. So if you want to go to the next slide. Inside the power plant, so in March 2012, they finally managed to get inside the power plant to see like how bad things were, because they had to clear the debris and do a lot of other cleanup activities before they could even get to where the fuel is. And so they discovered that within the certain parts of the power plant, the radiation is so strong that within 7 minutes you die. So and that measurement is 70 sieverts. That's not millisieverts, that's sieverts. So that's like, astronomically much, much more concentrated radiation. So of course, Japan was like, you know what? We're gonna shut down our nuclear reactors for a while. I think they started turning them back on eventually, but as the first reaction, they turned off all of their nuclear reactors. Next slide, please. So after the disaster, what does living with this situation look like? So it might be a little bit hard to see, but do we have any ideas about what these are images of? Scissors, yeah. Yep. And anything? Yep, a slipper. So does anyone have any guesses about why they're sparkly? Any guesses based on what I'm talking about?
Pixie dust?
not pixie dust. Yes, so those are all radiation. So if you looked at these objects with just your normal eyes, it would just look like a slipper and a pair of scissors. But these sparkles show through there's a special process where, if you want to go to the next slide. So this person, Takashi Morozumi, is a photographer, and he went to the Fukushima evacuation zone, and he found these ordinary everyday objects, and he used a special type of film that can capture the radiation in the form of those sparkles. And so that allows you to see what this invisible, I guess poison, you can call it, invisible poison, how much it is, and gives you a way to comprehend it. So the group I'm part of, Remembering Hiroshima, Imagining Peace, has this moving exhibit of these photographs. So you should definitely check us out. This exhibit will pop up again in the future. But next slide, please. So to go back to the disaster area, it's been seven years. People are still living in temporary housing. A lot of it is because rebuilding after tsunami is really difficult. And of course, in the evacuation zone, that stuff's going to be radioactive depending on the different types of radiation, because it depends on the particles. Some of that will dissipate to a large degree after 50 years, but a lot of it will take hundreds to thousands of years, if not more, to disintegrate to a point where it's safe, to live there with fewer consequences, I guess. So if you want to go back to your hometown, for example, that's not a simple decision to make, because not only do you have to decide how much that means to you versus how much is dangerous to you, you also have to consider you actually have to rebuild, because if you weren't there for several years, things start to fall apart, or things got destroyed by the tsunami. So it's a pretty complicated decision. Next slide, please. So when I was in Sendai in 2015, I visited some of the temporary housing that people lived in. So you can see it's kind of like one-story, kind of apartment style. According to the residents, not that warm in the winter because they're not very well insulated, and it wasn't meant to be there for 4 or 5 years or longer. Next slide, please. So we help the residents, we help them. A lot of the residents are elderly because the young people, after everything gets destroyed, there's no economy, so there's no jobs, so all the young people left to find work. And so the people living in the temporary housing are mostly older people, and elderly people, some things are a little bit harder because your body's not as, good as it used to be. So we help them with things like changing the filters and their air conditioning and things like that. And then we also talked to them and just heard about, things in their hobbies and their interests. So this is a picture of a school, pictures from an elementary school that's in Fukushima Prefecture, not within the evacuation zone, obviously. And so so each day they prepare a meal for the students, and they use only ingredients sourced from outside of the prefecture. So it was hard to see on the map before, but the way the radiation spreads is not like a perfect circle around the power plant. It's kind of uneven, but the stigma is attached to the Fukushima name. So if it's from Fukushima Prefecture, people don't want to use it. So they only, even though they're located in Fukushima, they only use food from outside the prefecture. And then they would take like 2 sample meals and measure the amount of radiation in them. And then if it's below the safe level, they let the students eat the meals. So next slide. So then if you're outside, here on the left, right outside the school, like in the garden, they have a radiation meter. So it says I think it's in sieverts. They use microsieverts for those meters. So it shows the amount of radiation impact right outside the school. Isn't that fun? Next slide. So one of the other places I visited was called Itate, which I mentioned earlier. It's on the outer edge of the evacuation zone. And so it's kind of like I guess like a commuter town in a way. Like you're only allowed to be there during the day, and you can't be there at night because you get exposed to too much radiation to be there all day long. But you can be there during the, so to go there, you have to wear 2 types of meters. One to measure the biological impact, and the other to measure the environmental amount of radiation. So the one on the left is the one that you clip to your body facing inwards, so it measures your absorption. And then the other one is you just like hold it near things, and then the numbers change. So like if you hold it near the sidewalk, the numbers are kind of low. You hold it near the grass, the numbers are higher because concrete can get washed off, the radiation gets washed off. Grass, it might get absorbed into the grass, it's in the soil. And then you keep a notebook. You keep a notebook saying like, I was there on this day for this many hours in this spot. And then I had like this reading on the meter, so you can see, you can keep track of how much exposure you're having. Next slide. So this, in Itate, it was primarily a farming village. And so what they did was, they have lots of fields, but if you want to start growing food in them, you have to get rid of the radioactive soil first. So they're doing decontamination work, which is basically taking off the top layer of the fields, putting them in garbage bags, and then taking dirt from other places that is clean and putting those in garbage bags, and then putting the garbage bags of contaminated dirt in the middle of a pile of garbage bags of clean dirt. So that's what the top right picture is of. Huge stack of hundreds of garbage bags of dirt with the contaminated ones in the middle. And so of course that's on top of another field. So they cleared off one field and then covered up another one. And then on the bottom right, here is a building. I'm sure it was fine like after the disaster, before the disaster and maybe after the disaster. But now that several years have passed, it of course fell into decay. And so, like I said before, when you come back to a place where people haven't lived for a while, you have to rebuild. And as a community development person, someone working with communities in Pittsburgh, like what I do in a place that people have been living for the whole time is rebuild. So it's really important to prepare for disasters and try to avoid having disasters happen so that you don't have to spend all your life rebuilding. Next slide, please. So I went to Japan a few weeks ago, and I went to Sendai, and it was right at the anniversary of the disaster. So this was part of a ceremony they had to honor the lives lost in the disaster, and also to kind of celebrate the rebuilding effort, but also mark the fact that it's still ongoing. It's been 7 years, but it's only halfway done, really. So these are candles, and they're lined up to make the word musubi, which means like connections. So connections to the people whose lives were lost, connections between each other. It's the relationships that have really been important in the rebuilding process, both economically but also socially and psychologically. Like the feeling of caring for one another is really important for the rebuilding process and for recovery. So I'm going to end with that note. So if you want to go to the next slide. Here are some additional resources, just a few articles that I thought were interesting. One is People Who Would Survive Nuclear War, which talks about a government commissioned report where they actually asked someone to create kind of like a fiction story of what it would be like if a nuclear disaster happened. And so but this was commissioned by the government, so it's kind of like a very unusual report, but also very interesting. And then the second one is Let's Put to Rest These Myths About the US and North Korea Relations. So as you know, things between North Korea and the US are kind of dicey right now. And this kind of provides a alternative perspective to what the media usually presents about like how North Korea feels and like why they continue to pursue nuclear aggression when they could not. And then a few other links. Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is about our campaign and some of the source information for that. Remembering Hiroshima, rememberinghiroshima.org. Check us out if you are curious about the photography exhibit I mentioned earlier and some of our other activities. And then, of course, follow the campaign on Facebook, Stop Banking the Bomb, and Beyond the Bomb, which is the PIT chapter of anti-nuclear activities. Thank you.
My name is Susan Smith, and I am with WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Pittsburgh branch. And so I'm introducing the next speaker, whose name is Andrew Ull. He represents Beyond the Bomb. Andrew is a graduate student of Kent State University's class of spring 2017, where he double majored in history and political science. Since graduation, he has been working with Beyond the Bomb, the campaign to educate the public on nuclear weapons and to build support for a no first use legislation in Congress. So, welcome, Andrew.
All right, so hello everyone. Thank you for coming to today's teach-in event. And for my presentation, we're going to focus on a different perspective now on nuclear power and nuclear weapons. We're going to talk about a history of U.S. nuclear strategy and the myths surrounding it. So a quick overview. We're going to discuss first the history of nuclear weapons and some of the historical reasons and motives that the U.S. government has used to build and deploy nuclear weapons. We're going to talk about and deconstruct a couple of popular myths and dogma that have legitimized nuclear weapons in this country. And then we're going to wrap it up with why it all matters. So why does the United States have nuclear weapons? This is a seemingly basic but deep-seated question that most people in this country don't consider at all, only subconsciously understand, or we just take it for granted. And even with the current ongoing tensions now between our enlightened president and North Korea regarding nuclear weapons, and therefore with nuclear weapons being brought back into the headlines, it is still far too easy to miss the fundamental question here and some of the problems that it illuminates. So different sources have different answers to this question, but not all answers are equally viable. So take, for example, the Nuclear Posture Review. This is a government document published by the Department of Defense that annually outlines U.S. nuclear military strategy. So the 2018 NPR, which was published just a couple of months ago, gave the following answer to why the U.S. has nuclear weapons. Quote, "The U.S. hoped conditions in recent years had been set for deep reductions in nuclear arsenals, and perhaps for their elimination. These aspirations have not been realized. America's strategic competitors have not followed our example. The world is more dangerous, not less." The implied answer from this statement from the Department of Defense is that America is somehow a tragic hero that valiantly attempted to rid the world of nuclear weapons, only for nefarious others to betray and undercut its efforts. This answer, however, is pure public relations, And like any public relations, it is an answer designed to cover up a horrifying reality. The reality is that nuclear weapons have their start and continued purpose in preserving US hegemony, the system of economic, political, and military dominance of others overseas for the self-interests of US rulers. This system and the rationales for keeping it in place has little, if anything, to do with the self-defense of ordinary citizens in this country or any other. And so this brings us to the actual origins of US nuclear strategy and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that ended World War II. So in the lead up to the bombings, within the US government, there are multiple intertwined and often complex reasons made for and against the decision to ultimately drop the bombs on these two cities. One of the most important reasons, however, that officials at the time consistently made was this: intimidation. Namely, the atomic bombs would intimidate the Soviet Union, keep them from joining the war in the Pacific in World War II, and therefore would protect US economic and political interests and gains in the Asian Pacific region following the end of the war. In other words, the atomic bombings were used to protect the spoils of war and were not at all to do with anything regarding self-defense. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were political decisions, not military-based decisions, and therefore they were made for the benefit of US politicians. So one of the most persistent myths about the atomic bombings is that they were necessary to prevent a mainland invasion of Japan, which would have cost far more lives lost, especially by the US, in the long run, as opposed to dropping the atomic bombs, which, according to this myth, saved more lives in the long run. This is untrue on two counts. First, US government estimates at the time calculated that had a US mainland invasion occurred and gone through, the total number of US lives lost would have been approximately 46,000 people. This is far lower than A, the number of lives lost in the atomic bombings in the first place, and B, it's far lower than the myth spread by Allied leaders after the war that anywhere from 500,000 to well over 1 million US lives would have been lost in a mainland invasion. Second, and much more importantly though, this myth presents a false choice. There didn't need to be a choice between bombing and invasion. The historical record bears out that the Japanese were already trying to surrender by this point. The US government denied the surrender, dropped the bombs, and then only after hundreds of thousands of lives were lost and murdered as a result of these bombs did the US then accept surrender, all for political reasons and for political gain of politicians. Dwight Eisenhower, then general at the time for the US, stated, quote, "The Japanese were ready to surrender and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing," end quote. Also at the time, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, William Leahy, had this to say. And he said the bombings were, quote, "of no material assistance to our war against Japan," end quote. And so to reiterate, the atomic bombings were unnecessary from a military perspective, and they had no moral calculus whatsoever. And as for the bombings themselves, and as referenced, combined, well over 200,000 lives were lost, many in the immediate blasts and aftermath, and then many more in the days, weeks, and months afterward as a result of radiation poisoning, injuries, deformities beyond human recognition, and so forth. Next slide. So then that brings us to the Cold War years after the end of World War II. And the main reasons that the US continued to build and pursue nuclear weapons during the Cold War remain generally the same: intimidation to preserve US hegemony. So throughout the Cold War, threats of nuclear war were leveled by the US not just against the Soviet Union, but also throughout the years against China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Lebanon, and so forth, just as a small example. These threats were made not for reasons of self-defense, but rather to protect US political and economic dominance, regardless of its benefit to any other group, population, or country. So one of the main assumptions and myths about the Cold War made is that this country's foreign policy was guided by the concepts of deterrence and mutually assured destruction, or in other words, a system of checks between two or more countries, potentially, that would incentivize self-defense and restraints for everyone involved. The reality is that the US never had deterrence and mutually assured destruction as a guiding principle of its foreign policy from the get-go. So to use just one example of this, in the early 1960s, US intelligence reported at the time that while the US nuclear arsenal contained about 185 intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, at that same time, the Soviet Union had 4 intercontinental ballistic missiles. And this is just one of numerous examples of Soviet numeric and technological inferiority in its arsenal throughout much of the Cold War, but not all of the Cold War, which we'll get to in a moment. And then back to now President Eisenhower at this time, he stated at one point to then Senator Lyndon Johnson, if we were to release our nuclear stockpile on the Soviet Union, the main danger would arise not from retaliation, but from nuclear fallout in the Earth's atmosphere. And then US General at this time, Curtis LeMay, also made this remark, that the US could eliminate the entire Russian military with nuclear strikes, quote, without losing a man to their, that is US, defenses. So all of this underscores the reality that deterrence was never a guiding principle and was never designed to be a guiding principle of US foreign policy during this time. Next slide. So this graph is from the Federation of Atomic Scientists, and it details 2 things. One, the number of nuclear weapons by the US in the blue line over the years, and the number of nuclear weapons stockpiled by the Soviet Union and then Russia during the same time, also during these years, since 1945. And as you can see, by the 1980s, the Soviet Union, in fact, gains a quite decisive edge in numeric superiority in this arms race during the Cold War. And then you'll also notice that starting in the 90s, and so forth to the present day, both Russia and the United States started to drastically reduce their nuclear arsenals from the tens of thousands that they both had to about 6,600 and 6,800 nuclear weapons that the 2 powers have today. This graph is certainly accurate, but numbers alone obscure some important details at different points during this timeline. So regarding the buildup during the 80s, the whole reason that Russia gained such an advantage at this time was precisely because it was so humiliated by its nuclear disadvantage in previous years, and was humiliated by the US routinely threatening nuclear war at different flashpoints throughout the Cold War, that Soviet leaders decided to double down on nuclear weapons building in order to avoid this situation in later years. And then to the next point about arms reduction since the Cold War, it's objectively good, certainly no doubt, that both the US and Russia have reduced their nuclear arsenals since this mad peak of 70,000 combined weapons at the height of the Cold War. That said, this obscures the fact that US actions and policies elsewhere since the end of the Cold War have sparked nuclear proliferation by others and in other areas, namely NATO expansion eastwards towards Russia, which has threatened Russia and made them think to rebuild their nuclear weapons. The invasions of Iraq and Libya in 2003 and 2011, and then threats of war against North Korea currently, as well as Iran currently and in previous years, that has given them reason to pursue or consider pursuing nuclear weapons against the United States for its own protection. Next slide. So why does this all matter? Why should we care about nuclear weapons from a US perspective, and why should we fight for its disarmament? There's a lot of reasons why, but I'm going to give my own to close out this presentation. So the first and main reason is that the main myth that is used to justify nuclear weapons is just that. It's a myth. Nuclear weapons are not here for our self-defense. They're not here for our benefit in any way as citizens. They're not about us at all. Us, as ordinary citizens of the United States, we are pawns in the game of nuclear strategy. Secondly, nuclear weapons are a tool that upholds a system of power that is both morally unjust and has the chance to get us all killed, whether as the result of callous calculation or miscalculation, retaliation, so forth, you name it. Historically, the United States has been the major driving force of nuclear weapons over the years. And as a result, we as US citizens have a moral responsibility to act out against this for the sake of other people around the world. And in this action, the US alone will not solve the problem of nuclear weapons. It is a global issue. However, through our actions, we can make the environment for disarmament that much more manageable and achievable. And we should go out and fight for that. Thank you.
This is Susan Smith again, and I'm from WILF Pittsburgh, which is Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And our next speaker is Peter. He is a retired associate professor of physics from the Beaver County campus of the Pennsylvania State University. He received his MS and PhD degrees in physics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Illinois in 1973 and 1970 and 1973 respectively. He received his AB in physics at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor in 1968. And so he will be the next one to address us with some things we need to know.
I've been thinking about physics on and off for a pretty long time, over 30 years, as you can see from my degrees. That makes them plausible that I did that actually. And so I don't know that I have exactly one place from which I got this, although I can give you references. But my interest is really maybe a little more informal than the title says, and that is that I think we should sort of take it easy a little bit. It's, you know, we don't have to be that threatened by North Korea. They're not about to shower us with nuclear weapons from the sky. They don't, I mean, I don't think we should be that paranoid anyway, but they're really not at that position right now. And the other thing that they can do, it's almost a favor for us to take it seriously. We can work together on it. So if I could get the first slide, which has some graphics with it. Basically, my conclusion from what I've read and what I think a number of other people think also is that, I'm sorry, am I doing too much moving? Is that they really don't have the capability to target us here in the United States with intercontinental ballistic missiles, at least for a couple of years and maybe even beyond that. If I can think informally about what's behind me, they don't have the ability to target us that accurately, and they haven't probably solved the reentry problem of bringing warheads down through the atmosphere to more or less direct contact with targets in the United States with any real accuracy. And there are a couple of reasons for that. In terms of the atmosphere, they have to bring warheads at very high speeds through the atmosphere and get them settled down enough so that they can be directed toward their targets. And that's a tough technology to master. It was hard for the US, it was hard for the Soviet Union. The first few attempts that actually successfully projected Soviet warheads, and they were a little ahead of us, about 4,500 miles, vaporized about 10 miles above the ground. So they weren't actually able to get objects to re-enter for quite some time, and we had to work pretty hard at it too. The technique that was used was to try to get a warhead, maybe like this, coming down, painted with material that would vaporize and leave the warhead and thereby cool it from 5,000 degrees to about 1,000 degrees, probably Fahrenheit. But that wasn't easy to master. And one of the big challenges there is that when it ablates, when the material comes off, it kind of causes the warhead to recoil back and forth, and you have to compensate for that. And almost certainly the North Koreans have not mastered that. And one of the reasons, which is in this slide, is that we've constrained them. Actually, we've constrained them in a lot of different ways. But one of the major ones is that they, in their tests to get at intercontinental ballistic missile quantities, to attain those, they've had to send the missile up and down near their borders for political or other reasons, maybe the security of the warheads. And they go, if this is the surface, if this is the Earth, say this is about 8,000 miles in diameter, they've sent those warheads up maybe a half a radius, and then they come, comparatively speaking, almost straight down, so that they won't go over nearby important countries such as Japan or South Korea. And so they can only go, and you can see the trajectories on the left here, and they can only go in a sort of up and down trajectory, which requires the energy necessary to go intercontinental distances, but it isn't anything like the trajectory that would involve the ablation and would involve the guidance of those warheads, if you want to call it guidance, to the United States. So there's almost, no way that they could have calibrated things. I mean, for one example, they reach a higher velocity or speed when they get near the Earth or get into the atmosphere and go through the atmosphere much more quickly than they would on the longer trajectories with the dotted lines. Those dotted lines involve a much more gradual entry back into the atmosphere from space. So instead of going up maybe 2,800 miles, they go 600 miles up for the intercontinental trajectories. So there's almost no way that they can represent that realistically with their constrained trajectories. And furthermore, when you think about how the nuclear weapons are tested, there's something else that they're constrained to that we weren't, and I'll leave that for you to think about, what that other constraint might be. It's very important. And we've worked our ways through that, but they haven't had a chance to. So, therefore, going on with this, maybe to the next slide, since they can't really reach us with intercontinental missiles that accurately come with pinpoint accuracy or even semi-pinpoint accuracy down to the ground, well, is there anything else they can do to us? I mean, do we have to worry about this in any other way? And my answer is yes and no. The S is that they can detonate missiles before they get into the atmosphere and produce almost like ball lightning. It's an electromagnetic pulse of radiation that comes from a fundamental place that I'll show you in the next slide, but I want to stay with this slide for a couple of minutes. You can see the electromagnetic pulse in a way visualized by the graphic pretty appropriately. I want to thank Dan, by the way, for putting a lot of work into this. And so you can get that electromagnetic disturbance with a lot of electricity and magnetism, and that can disrupt things on the ground for maybe up to hundreds of miles away. For a small example, there was, and this is going a little off script, but only for 30 seconds, there were tests made on Johnson Island back in the early 60s, actually above it, several hundred miles above it, about 1,000 miles from Hawaii, more or less toward the west, the west by southwest. And one or two of those nuclear explosions actually knocked out something like 300 streetlights all the way over in Hawaii, more than 800 miles away. So that was, it turned out, due to the electromagnetic pulse, and it did have an effect. And it can have an effect with us. Maybe the next slide, just for a second. This is actually a sort of a sign or a symbol of some very basic physics, which was discovered about in the early 1920s by a guy named Compton, called the Compton Effect, that showed that actually light or photons can actually have a punch like a baseball, and they can actually, or some other projectile with momentum, significant momentum in the case of gamma rays, and actually push electrons around. And that's basically how the electromagnetic pulse is generated, in that the explosions, the photons from the explosions actually push the charged particles and atoms around, and then produce and release prolific amounts of electricity and magnetism. So that's just a symbol of that, although a good symbol. I mean an accurate symbol. And then in the next slide, we see some graphics of some of the kinds of damage that could be done. And they could affect the infrastructure, and they could cause us a lot of problems. But if I might use a slightly informal term, if we man up and we figure out how to consolidate and take responsibility for our infrastructure, we can work through this problem in advance to a large degree, and actually we have facilities that do this. And not only that, if we keep our eyes open, if we go maybe to the next slide, we can start to take responsibility about other things that are like this. In other words, we can't blame every power failure on an electromagnetic pulse from an enemy. It turns out that there are all kinds of problems that can occur. For an example, from nature itself, the sun every so often releases solar flares, actually what are called coronal mass discharges, and if one of those comes our way, it can do a lot of disruption to our electrical infrastructure. There was a famous episode in, I think, the 1850s, and there have also been cases where the whole Canadian power line was almost knocked out, and it can do a lot of damage to our satellites. And there are other things. There's almost a long list of things that can happen that could be counteracted and planned against successfully with some credibility and some success if we took all of that money for building bombs, or some of it, and turned it instead toward figuring out how to deal with some of the problems that are listed behind me. We'd be better off as a country and as a society, and we could even invite the Koreans in to help us, because they probably have lots of ideas. I mean the North Koreans. They probably have lots of ideas about how to deal with this if we give them a chance. They might have a lot more than we realize. So I'm enumerating things like asteroidal impacts or close passes through the atmosphere like we had over Russia, I think over Siberia, what used to be called, I'm trying to think, the Ekaterinburg, I think, and some of those areas. There were recordings of shock waves and sound coming in 3 or 4 minutes delayed by the great distance and shattering windows, and that was documented. And there's also a possibility that some of the power disruptions are actually cyber attacks or hackings, and that could clobber the infrastructure even physically in ways that are not unlike with the electromagnetic pulse. And we could work together with other people and open doors to dealing with these problems and all sorts of other problems. And if we aren't too paranoid about it, basically take a more cosmopolitan attitude about all these things and work ourselves into a better position, both physically and culturally and morally. I guess there are 3 things there. So I think I'm done. I thank everybody for your attention and for being here today.
Okay. Once again, I'm Susan Smith. I'm with Pittsburgh WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Our 4th and final speaker today is Tom, who's a local activist. He will be talking about the nuclear arms industry as it relates to Pittsburgh, as well as to the country at large. And so let's give a welcome to Tom.
Well, thanks for coming, folks. We had some interesting presentations so far. We learned about how the effects of radiation can have, even if it's not a nuclear strike, when it's just a leakage situation as in Fukushima. We learned about some of the myths and the rhetoric around nuclear weapons and whether we're being told the truth or not with regard to the actual dialogue between North Korea as well as with other countries. And we heard a little bit about the science regarding these weapons and how they work, the impact they can have on everything in the universe, I guess, from the molecule to a city. But my presentation is going to focus on something else, which is the economic as well as some of the political situation around nuclear weapons and how this situation guides much of not just the conversation, but why we have nuclear weapons. Can I go to the next slide? So as you see on the screen, that's a nuclear strike. And whenever that happens, none of our disagreements, none of our animosity, a lot of things will not matter anymore. If it happens here, at least in this city, and Pittsburgh's gone, we'll have different problems then. But I think the important question is, how do we get to that point before it happens? And if you can go to the next slide. I have a bunch of words on the screen right there. I listed whatever I thought could lead to causing nuclear proliferation. I put down creation, the actual manufacture of these weapons, as well as the nuclear fissionable material, the weaponization of them, the money behind it, the research that goes into finding a perfect target to drop that bomb or to launch that ICBM. But those words really won't mean too much, at least for our conversation. I think more importantly is the physical moving parts. You can go to the next slide, Dan. Yes, the physical moving parts of how these nuclear strikes will be carried out, because those physical moving parts are very, very profitable for lots of multinational corporations. And I have on the slide here basically the triad system. This is the 3-part or 3-legged system as it's referred to in the defense industry of how a nuclear strike could possibly be launched. We have nuclear submarines that launch the Trident II missile system, a very profitable missile system that many corporations have money in. We have ICBMs, as Andrew referred to earlier, missiles that have propulsion systems and warheads, nose cones, containers. They have silos. They have personnel that take care of them. And then we have aircraft. We have planes, B-52 bombers, the Super Fortress or Stratofortress, and the B-2 bombers. That's what our arsenal mainly consists of now, like delivery systems. And those have engines, they have computers, they also have personnel, and they have what's euphemistically referred to as a payload. And you'll find if you look at defense industry terminology, you'll find lots of words like payload and delivery system, and even the word casualty is just a euphemism for, guess what, dead people, and ruined lives and destroyed cities, annihilated populations. But can you go to the next slide, Dan? So as I'm leading to, much of our military is privatized. The latest number I saw was that 600,000 private defense contractors are employed by the Pentagon, as well as close to $304 billion of the defense budget went to private contractors. They handle everything. They handle the propulsion systems, like I mentioned. They handle the manufacture of the material itself. They handle the testing facilities. They handle the laboratories. They train personnel, and they employ personnel. And they also handle much of the conversation around our weapons. But I'll get to that later. But all this is made possible by, guess what, banks. You go to the next slide. Banks have a lot of interest in these weapons, as well as in the contractors themselves. And defense contractors need something from banks, which is capital. They need lots of money to start some of these projects before they can get their payback from the federal government in terms of the contracts they get. These weapon systems cost lots and lots of money, and the banks are willing to provide it. And they're also willing to provide financial services, managing sort of the money of these defense contractors. Keep in mind, the defense industry, while it's a very lucrative one, is also can be a tumultuous one. There's ups and downs, there's defense cuts. So you have to have a financial manager for that too. And then there's also they invest in the companies themselves. It's very profitable to have stock in a company, I'm sure, like General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin. These are all organizations that do defense contracting work with the nuclear military industrial complexes. It's sometimes referred to as. Next slide. One of those organizations, those financial organizations, is PNC Bank. It's headquartered downtown Pittsburgh. It's been a bank for over 100 years. And it had $600 million in loans to what I counted were six defense contractors as of the latest report by Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is a joint project, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and the organization called PAX. So PNC Bank's one of those companies, and if you go to the next slide, I listed the 6 defense contractors that currently have some loan or some sort of financial relationship to PNC Bank. And the number that I recently saw calculated was close to $600 million is loaned out to these companies, or at least made available through credit. And that can take place in a variety of ways, like bonds, as well as credit revolving facilities, or even shares. But just know that these are the companies that they're invested in or have a financial relationship to, and that they do the work of making a military nuclear arsenal possible. They work on the Trident II missile system. That's what submarines shoot into the air and come back, re-enter the atmosphere, as Peter talked about. It's the submarine nuclear leg of the triad. And then other companies work on the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile, which is very profitable. It's been around for a while, and it has all those things: jet propulsion systems, the warhead. It has silos that need taken care of. Some companies service those. Other companies, like Acon, they run laboratories and testing facilities. Some build nuclear reactors. And all this stuff comes from somewhere, and a lot of times it comes from defense contractors. But can you go to the next slide? As in the next slide shows, though, we have a very interesting political system, because these defense contractors also, they fund politicians. And if I've listed some of the numbers on the slide as far as groups like Peace Action and Americans for Peace, they spent, I think, under $100,000 for federal candidates in 2016. Whereas if you go to the next step, even organizations that do policy work, whatever side they're on, whether they're more conservative or liberal, peace-focused, or more defense-oriented, they spent close to $1.1 million. Whereas the defense industry, at least what I've seen from OpenSecrets.org, which compiles information from the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, they quoted it as $17 million of federal candidates in 2016. So I asked the question, whose voice do you think is louder? It's a rhetorical one, because guess what? The industry has a louder voice than all of us do. If they want nuclear weapons, we'll have them. And it's unfortunate. And it may hijack the conversation that Andrew talked about earlier as far as what the myths are. Because how can we challenge those myths when our legislators aren't even listening to us? And next slide. Financial institutions also cannot be left out of this conversation. They spend lots and lots of money on politicians as well. I listed a few of them, especially the ones at PNC Bank. PNC Bank gave, I think it was $1.7 million to federal candidates in 2016. Some of the wonderful names on there are like Pat Toomey, Keith Rothfuss, Tim Murphy, John Boehner, according to opiatsecrets.org. You can take a guess how they feel about war and stuff like that. But they're certainly not going to challenge this system. And many of those other candidates I looked into, a lot of Republican candidates, and a lot of them had very pro-war positions on things like Syria, Iran, North Korea. So I don't know. I mean, financial institutions, you can't blame them for everything, but sometimes, at least in this situation, I think you can. And I don't think it's outlandish to ask a company or a corporation like PNC Bank to stop not just funding the contractors, but stop funding the candidates who are saying yes to nuclear war. So in the next slide, I put a picture of Hillary Clinton laughing about, I think that was whenever she was laughing about killing Gaddafi or something, very disgusting. But she also received money from PNC Bank. A lot of one of the largest contributors was the financial service industry for Hillary Clinton. But I don't know if that's correlated. It's not always direct, but she certainly likes war based on her record. A lot of people were afraid of before she got elected, before Trump got elected and before Hillary Clinton lost, people were more afraid of her getting elected sometimes than him about nuclear war because of her policy towards Russia. So keep that in mind sometimes. And the next slide, well, there's always Trump, who he didn't receive much from the financial industry, at least compared to Hillary or the defense contractor industry, but he still loves war. And there's a picture of him pretending to be an Air Force or Navy man wearing a hat. And that speaks for itself, I guess. So the next slide, if you go to it, and once again, we see pictures of nuclear explosions. These are tests, obviously. The United States has conducted thousands of tests over the course of the 20th century. And these, fortunately, I don't believe, well, actually, one of these might actually be from one of the actual bombings over Japan. But keep in mind, this is where the money goes. This is what the investment is. This is what the real end result of all those jet propulsion systems and payloads and classes people teach and classes people go to learn how to be an engineer or a software programmer, all those things. And when they go into work for these companies, and this is where it leads, a nuclear explosion that could kill hundreds of thousands of people and possibly trigger a nuclear war. If that sounds hyperbolic, it's not. And I hope people look at these images and they're ingrained in your head and they distress you because they should. This is a rational reaction to something that's unacceptable. We shouldn't have to deal with this as people who go to work or people who go to school, people who pay taxes, and know that our tax money is going not just to organizations like the defense contractors, but going to this, which is largely out of our hands. If Donald Trump decides to drop a nuclear bomb, guess what? No one here will be consulted, and we certainly won't be listened to after the fact either. So I think if you go to the next slide, there's another depiction of a nuclear strike. I loaded them up on here because I really want you to care. And the last slide says you have to do something about this. I want you to think about that statement, because we can do teach-ins, we can do protests, but we can't do it for you. And if you're listening at home, including the employees of PNC Bank or their investigators who are listening to this video or this slide presentation, hoping to find some dirt on whoever, I hope you listen and think long and hard about these nuclear strikes and what you're funding. Because I have one thing to say, is that we're not going to take it anymore. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We really appreciate the 4 speakers who've been willing to provide information for us, and to those of you who came to watch, and those of you who will watch this later as they show up on the internet. We appreciate your being here and would like now to go into a period of questions and answers and have a bit of a discussion and hear some opinions from the other people who are present. So,
Come, you masters of war, you that build the big guns, you that build the death planes, you that build all the bombs, you that hide behind walls, you that hide behind desks. Well, I just want you to know I can see through your masks. You that never done nothing but build to destroy. You play with my world like it's your little toy. Put a gun in my hands and you hide from my eyes. and you turn and run farther as the fast bullets fly.